You know, usually when we talk about a major military operation or like a targeted decapitation strike, there is this prevailing expectation of absolute precision.
Right, it's viewed as a very surgical thing.
Exactly. We like to think of it almost like sterile engineering.
Mm.
You identify the target, you execute the operational plan, the ordnance drops, and then the intelligence analysts just, point to the satellite imagery in a briefing room and say, there it is. The building is gone. Problem solved.
It is treated as a fundamentally binary event. I mean, it's either threat active or threat eliminated.
Yeah, it's clean. And it is incredibly comforting to policymakers and the public alike. We deeply prefer our geopolitical maneuvers to be highly visible, to be neatly categorized with a clear beginning, middle, and a really definitive end.
Which is rarely how it actually works.
No, not at all. Because then you step into the extraordinarily complex world of Middle Eastern geopolitics, regime survival doctrines, and asymmetric warfare, and suddenly that neat binary X-ray machine is just completely shattered. We are looking at a strategic landscape today that is, well, honestly, it is murky to the point of being opaque.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. The illusion of control completely evaporates once that first missile leaves the silo.
It really does. So today we are taking a deep dive into a highly revealing transcript from Novara Media featuring Vali Nasser. He's a professor of international affairs and Middle East studies at Johns Hopkins University.
And he's also the author of Iran's Grand Strategy, so he really knows this ecosystem.
Right. And our mission today is unpacking the immediate and deeply chaotic aftermath of the massive United States and Israeli joint airstrikes on Iran that took place in late February 2026. This operation most notably included the successful assassination of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei.
Yeah, this is recent seismic history.
It is actively rewriting the geopolitical rulebook as we speak. But before we get into the deeply intricate weeds of Professor Nasser's analysis, we need to set a firm boundary for the discussion today for you listening.
Yes, and this is absolutely vital to establish up front. The source material we are examining today contains highly charged geopolitical, military, and political content involving the United States, Israel, and Iran.
Exactly.
We are looking at this purely to convey the ideas and analysis contained in the original source material. We are not taking any sides, nor are we endorsing any of the viewpoints, policies, or military actions discussed. Our goal is strictly to help you understand the expert analysis presented in the text.
Thank you for laying that out. It's so important to keep that context. Okay, let's unpack this. Because the central paradox of this entire situation is truly mind-bending.
It really defies all the conventional modeling.
It does. When you launch a combined strike of this unprecedented magnitude, taking out the supreme leader, bombing deeply entrenched strategic military sites, hitting the core of the state apparatus, the expectation, certainly within the Oval Office, was an immediate, cascading, and irreversible collapse of the Iranian government.
They thought the state would simply fold under the pressure.
But that didn't happen. Despite all the confident projections of a quick, clean victory, Iran has shown this shocking, almost unnerving structural resilience.
Right, and according to Professor Nasser's analysis, this assassination might have actually unlocked a much more dangerous, volatile, and globally destabilizing military scenario for the West than the one that existed before the bombs fell.
Which is just wild to think about. It's like the stark difference between breaking a pane of glass and breaking open a hornet's nest. You might succeed in the physical kinetic act of destruction, but the secondary and third-order consequences are entirely different.
And infinitely more lethal than what your initial modeling anticipated.
So to understand how the global intelligence community and political leadership misread this so profoundly, we have to start by looking inside the room where the decision was made.
The mismatched war room.
Yeah, exactly. You have two tightly bound allies, the U.S. and Israel, executing a massive joint operation. But their underlying expectations for what they were actually trying to achieve had completely diverged. It is honestly staggering when you look at the disconnect.
It really is. Israel, according to Nasser's reading of the situation, fully expected a long, grueling, and incredibly bloody campaign.
They weren't looking for a quick PR win.
No, not at all. Their strategic goal wasn't just a quick hit to send a message. They wanted to fundamentally dismantle the Islamic Republic's military capabilities, break down the Iranian state as a cohesive entity, and permanently alter the balance of power in the Levant and the Gulf.
which, strategically speaking, is a massive multi-generational undertaking, right?
Absolutely. To dismantle a state of that size and complexity requires sustained, multi-year military commitment. It takes enormous financial and logistical resources, and crucially, an institutional acceptance of prolonged regional chaos. Israel was prepared for a marathon of attrition.
But then you contrast that with President Donald Trump's expectation going to the exact same operation. Trump was anticipating a highly sanitized, incredibly short, and fundamentally clean war.
The operational mindset in Washington was just completely disconnected from Israel's.
It was. The thought process was like, we assassinate the supreme leader, we drop bunker busters on some key strategic command sites, a new, pliable, friendly leadership magically emerges from the ensuing dust, and the war ends immediately before the weekend.
Right, a very cinematic view of warfare.
Exactly. He wanted to take a rapid victory lap, claim to the American electorate that he had single-handedly solved the Middle East, and declare that he brought Iran, quote, in from the cold.
What's fascinating here is the sheer bureaucratic mechanics of how this massive policy misalignment was allowed to happen. Because in any standard functional government apparatus, the decision to go to war, especially a major theater-wide war in the Middle East, requires a grueling, deeply adversarial process of interagency friction.
You mean all the different departments arguing it out?
Yes, usually you have the State Department, the Pentagon, the National Security Council, and all 17 intelligence agencies fighting it out in the Principals Committee. You identify a specific threat, you propose diplomatic and military solutions, you rigorously model the financial and human costs.
You try to figure out how it could all go horribly wrong.
Exactly. You red team the enemy's potential blowback, and you spend months, if not years, laying the groundwork to sell this operation to the public and to Congress.
But Nasser points out that the U.S. policy process here was essentially a complete vacuum. None of that rigorous interagency combat actually happened.
Right, because on the American side, there was effectively only one singular decision-maker who mattered in the moment, which was the president.
So that lack of a foundational strategic anchor is exactly what creates a policy vacuum. And nature abhors a vacuum.
It really does. The surrounding cabinet, particularly the Secretary of Defense and the National Security Advisor, were not acting as a constitutional or strategic check on executive impulse.
They weren't pushing back.
No, they had transformed into an echo chamber, essentially parroting and validating the president's instincts. This altered the diplomatic math entirely. It meant that Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel didn't have to navigate the skepticism of the American intelligence community.
Or brief, skeptical congressional oversight committee.
Exactly. He only had to convince one single person.
It sounds like, it sounds like Israel was sitting at the table playing a highly complex, multi-decade grand strategy board game, meticulously moving pieces to secure long-term regional hegemony.
Right.
While the U.S. thought they were just pulling a loose thread on a sweater, expecting the whole geopolitical fabric of Iran to instantly, cleanly unravel in a matter of days.
That's a great way to put it.
But the obvious question is why? Why was the American president so easily persuaded to greenlight an operation carrying such massive, uncalculated, and frankly existential risks? Especially when just a year prior, during the 12-day war the previous summer, the administration was reportedly furious with Israel, suggesting they were reckless and lacked a coherent exit strategy.
It is a drastic and sudden pivot in foreign policy, for sure. Nasser's analysis breaks down a few key drivers that facilitated this persuasion. First, you have immense, unyielding domestic political pressure.
The donors and the hawks, right?
Yes. Major political donors and highly influential hawkish politicians, Nasser specifically names figures like Senator Lindsey Graham, were aggressively pushing the administration to adopt Israel's maximalist position.
Okay, so heavy domestic lobbying.
And second, there was this looming coercive diplomatic threat, quietly articulated by figures like Secretary of State Marco Rubio, suggesting that Israel was going to launch this existential war regardless of U.S. approval. The logic presented to the Oval Office was that the United States would inevitably be dragged into the conflict to defend Israel anyway, so America might as well step to the front, lead the strike, and claim the historical credit.
The classic, our ally is going to drive the car off the cliff anyway, so we better jump into the driver's seat to steer defense. I mean, it's an abdication of strategic restraint disguised as leadership.
It really is. But the real catalyst, the actual psychological spark that ignited this entire powder keg, was the administration's reaction to domestic demonstrations occurring inside Iran at the time.
Oh, right, the protests.
Yeah. When protests erupted on the streets of Tehran and other major cities, the president became overly excited. He viewed these protests through an incredibly optimistic, almost cinematic lens, seeing an illusion of imminent systemic collapse.
Like one more push and the whole thing falls over.
Exactly. He genuinely thought, this is the moment. The regime is already falling on its own, and I can be the historic, decisive figure who gives it the final push and closes the book on the Iran problem forever.
So the goalposts were constantly moving.
Constantly. The administration's rationale kept shape-shifting to fit the desired outcome. First, the goal was to support democratic protesters. Then it morphed into forcing a new, highly restrictive nuclear deal. And finally, it escalated into outright kinetic regime change.
Which perfectly illustrates that there was absolutely no foundational strategic objective. They were throwing justifications at the wall to see what stuck to a predetermined military action.
It was policy built entirely on hope.
Yeah, instead of identifying a concrete national security problem and carefully reverse engineering a viable solution based on the cold, hard reality of the region, they made a snap, emotionally driven decision based on the overexcitement of a perceived, fleeting historic moment.
And once that executive decision was made, the entire massive apparatus of the U.S. military just blindly rushed to implement it without gaming out the alternate scenarios.
And if you don't allow a rigorous internal debate on the potential costs and catastrophic failures of a policy, you structurally blind yourself to the enemy's explicitly stated reactions. You construct a reality where the enemy behaves exactly as you want them to, rather than how they are actually preparing to act.
Which leads directly to a part of this transcript that is absolutely baffling to read.
Oh, the surprise about the retaliation.
Yes. The U.S. administration was reportedly shocked, genuinely taken aback and surprised, that Iran retaliated by immediately taking the war to the Persian Gulf, targeting shipping lanes and allied infrastructure.
How is that level of surprise even possible? I mean, Iran explicitly, loudly, and repeatedly warned the international community that if they were struck, the Gulf would burn.
It wasn't exactly a secret.
The Gulf nations themselves knew it was coming and were bracing for impact. So why was the U.S. intelligence and policy apparatus caught off guard?
Because acknowledging Iran's capability and willingness to strike the Gulf fundamentally undermined the political narrative of a short, clean war.
Right, if you admit it's going to be a disaster, you can't sell the war.
Exactly. If you admit that an airstrike on Tehran will result in the immediate closure of the Strait of Hormuz, skyrocketing global energy prices, and massive casualties at U.S. bases in the region, the policy becomes unsellable.
So they just ignored it.
Pretty much. That intelligence, those stark warnings, were likely ignored, suppressed, or simply dismissed as bluster in the Oval Office. They substituted pure hope for rigorous strategy.
And that catastrophic lack of basic scenario planning leads directly into what is arguably the biggest, most fatal blind spot the U.S. and Israel shared going into this campaign.
They completely underestimated their enemy.
They completely, fundamentally underestimated Iran's capacity to absorb punishment, adapt, and survive. They thought they were dealing with a fragile, centralized autocracy that would shatter. Instead, they ran headfirst into a state machinery designed specifically for this exact doomsday scenario.
It really is a modern masterclass in asymmetric resilience and institutional survival.
So let's dive into exactly how Iran survived this initial massive decapitation blow. Because the prevailing expectation in the West was that the moment the supreme leader was killed and the command bunkers were vaporized, the military would freeze, panic, and fold.
The head is gone, so the body dies.
Right. Instead, Nasser points out a terrifying psychological shift that immediately took hold in Tehran. Iran's surviving leadership determined in that moment that this would be their last war with the United States.
They burned the diplomatic boats.
They did. They are not looking for a diplomatic off-ramp. They are not looking to return to the uneasy status quo of sanctions and shadow wars. They made a definitive calculus that they will either cease to exist completely or they will absorb absolutely everything the U.S. and Israel can throw at them, exhaust the Western war machine, and then force a total permanent recalculation of power in the Middle East.
To understand the mechanics of how they survived the sheer kinetic force of February 2026, we have to look back to the lessons they absorbed during the 12-day war from the previous summer.
That brief clash was basically a test run for them.
Exactly. That brief but intense conflict was essentially a massive, high-stakes stress test for the Iranian regime's survival architecture. During those 12 days, they took heavy, precise hits, suffered deeply humiliating intelligence penetrations, and their command and control apparatus looked highly dysfunctional and sluggish.
But they didn't just ignore those failures.
No, the crucial takeaway is that they did not ignore them. They learned from them extremely quickly. Nasser specifically notes that Iranian strategists realized they barely survived that summer specifically because their state apparatus was far too centralized.
The head of the snake was too exposed.
Right, and the body couldn't move without direct orders from Tehran. So Ayatollah Khamenei, in the months before he was assassinated, initiated a massive sweeping decentralization project across the entire military and civilian infrastructure.
He fundamentally rewired the architecture of the state and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC.
He understood that a decapitation strike was not just a possibility, but an inevitability. So he pushed operational decision-making authority down to much, much lower levels.
Like giving the keys to the local guys.
Yes, to regional commanders, local base commanders, and individual missile silo operators. He created highly redundant, overlapping decision-making bodies that could operate entirely independently of the central capital.
So if Tehran goes dark, the fight doesn't stop.
Precisely. If Tehran went dark, if the communications grids were jammed or destroyed, local commanders had pre-delegated authority to continue executing the war plan autonomously.
It's biological, almost. It's like a starfish. You can cut it into pieces, and not only does it not die, but the severed limbs continue to move and eventually regenerate.
That's a hauntingly accurate analogy.
And they didn't just change the flowcharts. They physically prepared for a siege. They aggressively stockpiled food and medical supplies. They built deep subterranean infrastructure for the surviving leadership to operate entirely in hiding, immune to satellite surveillance, and they massively accelerated the mass production of their drone and ballistic missile capabilities.
And this preparation reveals a brilliant, if deeply terrifying, military calculus regarding the nature of modern warfare. The Iranian strategists looked at the staggering U.S. and Israeli arsenals, the F-35 stealth fighter jets, the Tomahawk cruise missiles, the massive payload strategic bombers.
The high-end, extremely expensive stuff.
Right. And they realized something highly counterintuitive. In a protracted, asymmetric conflict, offensive weapons do not decide the victor. Defensive capabilities do.
Which completely flips traditional Western military doctrine on its head. You look at an F-35 stealth fighter and you instinctively think that is the pinnacle of military power. Whoever has that wins.
It's the shiny object syndrome.
Yeah, but you're saying that in a war of sheer attrition, it's actually the defensive capabilities, specifically how long you can financially and logistically afford to shield your own infrastructure, that decides who is left standing.
Precisely. It all comes down to the brutal, unforgiving math of interception. The U.S. and Israel rely heavily on highly advanced, incredibly expensive, and technologically dense defensive systems like the Patriot missile batteries or the Arrow system to intercept incoming threats.
Because they have to protect their assets.
Yes. And Iran knows with absolute certainty that they cannot match Western offensive technology pound for pound. They don't have stealth bombers. But they can manufacture tens of thousands of rudimentary, cheap, but highly lethal kamikaze drones like the Shaheds and mid-range ballistic missiles.
Let's break down that math, because this is where the strategy goes from theoretical to terrifyingly practical. A single U.S. Patriot interceptor missile, just the missile itself, not the radar or the launcher, costs roughly $4 million.
$4 million for one single shot.
And Iran is launching waves of Shahed drones that cost maybe $20,000 each to manufacture in a rudimentary factory. Yeah. So if the U.S. and Israel have to fire a $4 million interceptor to guarantee the destruction of a $20,000 drone, the defensive economy of the West collapses in a matter of weeks.
It is entirely unsustainable.
That is the exact math Iran is betting its entire survival on.
Iran's grand strategy is not to win the opening glorious exchange of fire. Their strategy is a deliberate, highly disciplined absorption of the initial, massive, high-tech punches from the West.
Just taking the hits.
Exactly. They are intentionally letting Israel and the U.S. exhaust their multi-million-dollar defensive interceptor stockpiles by shooting down endless waves of cheaper, expendable Iranian ordnance.
So what does this all mean for you listening? It's basically Muhammad Ali's famous rope-a-dope strategy from the rumble in the jungle against George Foreman.
That's exactly what it is.
You lean back heavily on the ropes, you cover your face to protect the vitals, and you deliberately let Foreman punch himself out. You take the body blows, you let him expend all his explosive energy until his arms are heavy, his breathing is ragged, and he has nothing left in the tank.
And he thinks he's winning the whole time.
Right. And only then, when he is totally exhausted and defenseless, do you step off the ropes and launch your real devastating attack.
That is the exact real-time dynamic playing out in the Gulf. Iran is sitting deep inside its mountain bunkers, watching the U.S. Navy and allied bases in the Gulf slowly run out of Patriot and Standard missile interceptors.
Just watching the numbers tick down.
Yeah, they're monitoring the logistics, watching the defensive shields deplete as supply chains struggle to bring in replacements from half a world away.
Imagine the sheer psychological terror of that realization setting in at the Pentagon. You've been dropping bunker busters and successfully shooting down incoming missiles for a week and a half. The politicians in Washington are popping champagne, thinking the operation is a massive success because you've degraded Iranian radar and hit their bases.
It looks like victory on paper.
But then the intelligence analysts look at the data, look at the supply logistics, and realize with cold dread, the real war hasn't even started yet. Iran's initial sluggishness wasn't incompetence. It was a trap.
It was a very calculated delay.
They are just patiently waiting for day 10 or day 11 when the Western interceptor tubes are physically empty. And then the real overwhelming offensive barrage begins, and there's nothing left to stop it.
It profoundly highlights the lethal arrogance of the initial Western assumption. They mistook a deliberate, disciplined strategy of attrition for institutional weakness.
And this incredible level of strategic patience, this deeply calculated, almost unnatural restraint shown by the Iranian military apparatus, brings us to what might be the most ironic, counterintuitive, and frankly, jaw-dropping revelation in this entire transcript.
This is the part that really shocks people.
Yeah, and it is directly regarding the man who the U.S. and Israel just publicly celebrated assassinating, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei.
This is the precise moment where the popular Western narrative completely violently inverts upon itself.
Because the explosive paradigm-shifting insight Professor Nasr delivers here is that Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, a man who is undeniably a hardline cleric, intensely anti-American, and a lifelong adversary of the West, was actually, in practical military terms, acting as a massive handbrake on Iran's aggression.
It is a critical, absolutely vital nuance that is entirely lost in the triumphant political rhetoric of a decapitation strike.
Right, because the rhetoric is just, we killed the bad guy.
Exactly. Khamenei was an ideologue, certainly. He oversaw a deeply oppressive domestic regime. But on the international stage, when dealing with existential threats to the nation-state, he was fundamentally a risk-averse pragmatist.
He wasn't a reckless gambler.
No, Nasr points out two incredibly specific structural restraints that Khamenei personally maintained, much to the deep frustration of his own military commanders. First, his religious fatwa, a binding Islamic legal decree that explicitly prevented the Iranian state from developing a nuclear weapon.
And we really need to pause and look at the theological weight of a fatwa in Usuli Shia jurisprudence, because Western analysts chronically misunderstand this.
They treat it like a political talking point.
Exactly. A fatwa from the supreme leader isn't just a white paper or a temporary policy stance that can be easily discarded. Under the doctrine of Vilayat-e-Faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurist, his decree is considered religiously binding law on the believer.
It's deeply ingrained.
Khamenei believed, strategically, that maintaining the doctrine of civilian nuclear capability, staying right on the threshold without crossing it, was significantly safer for long-term regime survival than actually building a bomb, which he knew would guarantee a global coalition aimed at his destruction.
Exactly. Western intelligence often dismissed the fatwa as mere theological window dressing, but internally it functioned as a very real, very rigid institutional barrier against the most extreme factions of the military.
It held them back.
And the second restraint Nasr highlights is even more stunning when you consider the current military reality. Khamenei issued a strict, direct, and unyielding order to the IRGC, limiting the maximum range of their ballistic missiles to 2,000 kilometers.
He explicitly legally forbade his own military from building missiles with a 5,000-kilometer range, which is exactly what the IRGC aerospace commanders actively wanted to build.
Yeah.
Why? I mean, what is the strategic difference between 2,000 and 5,000 kilometers?
The geography of the threat. A 2,000-kilometer missile can hit Israel, American bases in the Gulf, and parts of Eastern Europe. But a 5,000-kilometer missile can reach deep into Western Europe. It can strike London, Paris, Berlin. Khamenei intentionally, deliberately kept Western Europe out of the crosshairs.
Because he didn't want to unite them against him.
Precisely. He knew that if European capitals felt a direct kinetic threat from Iranian missiles, Europe would abandon its diplomatic nuance and fully join a unified, aggressive, U.S.-led coalition against Iran. He was managing the threat matrix to prevent full global isolation.
He even stated publicly on the record that his own hardline commanders were furious with him for holding them back. And Nasser reveals something even more staggering about the broader assassination campaign itself.
The pattern of who was being targeted.
Yes. If you look at the track record, the specific commanders that Israel had been systematically identifying and assassinating over the past year, culminating in the supreme leader himself, were, relatively speaking, the more moderate, risk-averse, cautious figures within the regime's vast military apparatus.
They were taking out the stabilizers.
Here's where it gets really interesting for you listening. So, Western politicians, people in the U.S. and Israel, are popping champagne and cheering the targeted death of the one guy who was literally sitting at the head of the table telling his generals, no, you cannot build a nuclear weapon, and no, you cannot build missiles that reach London or Paris's.
It's totally counterproductive.
It's like cheering in triumph because you successfully sneaked onto a runaway train heading towards your house, and your great sabotage was ripping out the emergency brakes. You didn't stop the train. You just ensured there is absolutely nothing left to slow it down before impact.
That is exactly what decapitation strategies almost always achieve in the long run. If we connect this to the bigger historical picture, military history is absolutely riddled with this exact tragic paradox.
This isn't the first time this has happened.
Not at all. When you systematically kill the top, older brass of a militant organization or an adversary state, the guys who have accumulated wealth, institutional status, and a general preference for maintaining the status quo, you instantly create a massive power vacuum.
And someone has to fill it.
Right, and that vacuum is almost never filled by someone more moderate or compliant. It almost always, inevitably, elevates a younger, significantly more radical, fiercely aggressive generation that is eager to escalate the conflict to prove its own legitimacy and avenge its predecessors.
Which completely vaporizes President Trump's seemingly naive assumption that if you just drop a bomb on the top guy, some moderate in a tie, an Iranian version of a compliant, Western-facing bureaucrat would magically step up to the podium out of the rubble, shake hands, and sign a surrender document.
That is a total fantasy.
It is a profound misreading of Iranian internal dynamics. Instead of a compliant bureaucrat, power has forcefully and irreversibly shifted to the battle-hardened, mid-level field commanders of the IRGC.
And these are very different kinds of leaders.
They really are. These are men whose worldview wasn't formed in the quiet theological seminaries of Qom, or in the diplomatic backrooms of Geneva negotiating nuclear treaties. Their worldview was forged in the brutal, chaotic, incredibly bloody frontline meat grinders of Syria, Aleppo, and Iraq.
They've seen the worst of it.
They have spent the last decade fighting the U.S. and its proxies directly in the dirt. They are intimately comfortable with immense violence, they are highly risk-tolerant, and crucially, they are no longer bound by Khamenei's old religious fatwas or his 2,000-kilometer range limits.
They are completely off the leash.
The new IRGC leadership structure that the West just inadvertently empowered is infinitely more dangerous and infinitely more willing to use catastrophic force than the leadership they'd just spent billions of dollars to kill.
But wait, this brings up a massive contradiction.
What's that?
Well, if Israel's intelligence is as phenomenal as we are led to believe, and we know they penetrated Iran's security apparatus deeply enough to locate and assassinate the supreme leader, didn't Prime Minister Netanyahu know this? Didn't the Israeli intelligence apparatus fully realize that killing the cautious old guard would inevitably unleash this radical, uncontrollable youth movement within the IRGC?
That is the million-dollar question.
They absolutely knew. The Mossad and Israeli military intelligence are acutely aware of the internal demographics and ideological leanings of the IRGC. And this is where we have to peel back the layers and understand Israel's true endgame in this conflict.
Because it differs drastically from the stated goals in Washington, according to Nasser.
It really does. Nasser clarifies that Israel has never actually had a strategic policy of moderating its enemies. They don't care about putting a moderate in a tie in charge of Tehran. Israel's fundamental goal here is to Syriify Iran.
Syriify, that's a loaded term. Let's break down exactly what that means in this context.
Meaning they want to fracture the Iranian state so profoundly and inject so much internal kinetic chaos that the nation descends into total institutional collapse, sectarian violence, and a multi-faction civil war, exactly like what happened to Syria over the last decade.
Wow, so complete destabilization.
Exactly. Israel's strategic calculus is incredibly dark, but logically straightforward from their security perspective. A functionally broken, internally bleeding state engaged in a desperate, multi-faction civil war poses absolutely no organized, conventional military threat to the state of Israel.
Because they're too busy fighting each other.
Right. If Iran spends the next generation fighting itself in the burning ruins of its own cities, Israel's primary existential strategic problem is permanently solved. They didn't bomb Iran to change the regime's mind. They bombed Iran to shatter the nation's spine.
That is an incredibly chilling strategic objective. But this dark calculus by Israel bombing infrastructure to shatter the state into civil war relies on a massive foundational assumption. It assumes that the Iranian people, once the bombs start falling, will applaud the airstrikes, seize the moment of chaos, and finish the job of tearing their own country apart.
Which is a huge assumption.
Did that actually happen? Did the Iranian public react the way Western planners modeled?
The domestic response has fundamentally, completely defied Western expectations and intelligence modeling.
Because the explicit expectation from the U.S. and Israel was that the moment the sirens wailed and the bombs started falling, the Iranian public, who, let's be unequivocally clear, have deeply legitimate, long-standing grievances against this authoritarian regime, would use the chaos as a tactical opportunity to violently overthrow the government.
Right, and we must absolutely acknowledge that stark reality. The Iranian public broadly and deeply dislikes the Islamic Republic.
Oh, without a doubt.
They have not forgotten the brutal, bloody crackdowns on domestic dissent, particularly the massacres and executions of protesters that happened just months prior in January. The collective trauma, the economic suffocation, and the visceral anger toward the regime's domestic abuses are very real and very raw.
But Professor Nasser points out that almost overnight, the priorities of the ordinary Iranian citizen shifted entirely. And it wasn't because they suddenly fell in love with the Ayatollahs.
Oh, not at all.
It was because of what the U.S. and Israel specifically chose to bomb, and the apocalyptic rhetoric of what they threatened to do. They didn't just cleanly target military bases in the remote desert. The airstrikes hit critical civilian infrastructure, and most shockingly, they bombed irreplaceable historical and cultural heritage sites.
Which was a massive psychological trigger.
They bombed areas near the ancient city of Isfahan, a crown jewel of Safavid architecture. They destroyed parts of the Gulistan Palace complex, which dates back to the Qajar era. And on top of this physical destruction of their heritage, President Trump publicly threatened to legally alter Iran's borders at the end of the war and suggested arming ethnic separatist groups to physically carve the country into smaller, weaker pieces.
Which is, quite frankly, a catastrophic psychological and strategic miscalculation by the West. By targeting heritage sites and threatening the territorial integrity of the nation, you have taken a fierce, localized domestic political dispute, the question of do we like this specific government, and you have instantly escalated it into an existential threat to the nation itself.
You've made it about survival.
Exactly. For decades, the binary question inside Iran was, are you pro-regime or anti-regime? But when foreign bombs are vaporizing your cultural history, when the stunning Nashi Jahan Square is threatened, and when foreign leaders are casually talking about erasing the borders your ancestors bled for, that domestic question is completely subsumed by a terrifying new one. Are you pro-survival or pro-destruction of Iran?
And when you frame the conflict in those stark existential terms, it taps into something much, much older and deeper than the current government.
It really does. To understand this reaction, we have to zoom out and look at the massive, sweeping scope of Iranian history. The Islamic Republic, the current regime, has been in power for roughly 50 years.
Just a drop in the bucket.
Right, because Iran, as a distinct civilization, as a deeply rooted cultural and linguistic identity, has existed for nearly 7,000 years. The concept of Iran Shar, the Iranian cultural sphere, is deeply embedded in the psyche. The country has existed within its current modern nation-state boundaries since the 1500s.
So the regime is just a temporary phase in their eyes.
In the grand tapestry of Iranian history, a 50-year-old regime is a mere blip. It is less than 1% of their timeline. When the physical, territorial existence of that ancient nation-state is threatened by outsiders, a deep, primal, unifying nationalism activates. It forcefully and immediately overshadows domestic political grievances, no matter how severe and legitimate those grievances are in peacetime.
And this rapid coalescing of national identity explains why the reformist faction inside Iran, the politicians, intellectuals, and activists who historically pushed for normalization with the West, who advocated for diplomacy and incremental change from within, have been completely, utterly discredited.
They have been marginalized into absolute irrelevance. You simply cannot stand on a podium and preach the virtues of Western diplomacy, human rights, and domestic political reform when Western-made bombs are actively falling on your civilian hospitals, your schools, and your historical palaces.
It just rings incredibly hollow.
It does. The brutal, kinetic reality of the war makes any plea for moderation or Western alignment look not just foolish, but akin to outright treason in the eyes of a terrified populace.
There is a highly specific, deeply resonant anecdote from Professor Nasser in the transcript that perfectly encapsulates this psychological whiplash. He talks about a close friend of his father's currently living in Iran.
Ah, yes, the World Cup story.
Yeah, this individual is a former military man. He vehemently hates the current government. He is not a practicing Shia Muslim, and he is utterly opposed to the regime's strict societal rules. In fact, his hatred for the government was so profound that during the last World Cup, he actually rooted against the Iranian national soccer team just to spite the regime and deny them a propaganda victory.
Which, in a soccer-crazed nation like Iran, is a massive, highly visible statement of profound political protest and alienation.
Exactly. It shows a deep severing of his identity from the state. But Nasser says that since the U.S. and Israeli airstrikes began, this exact same man has done a complete 180-degree psychological turn.
His whole perspective flipped.
He saw the horrific images of plumes of black smoke rising over the ancient domes of Isfahan. He saw actual Iranian children being pulled from the concrete rubble of civilian infrastructure. And suddenly, his burning hatred for the government evaporated in the overwhelming face of a foreign kinetic attack on his home.
It's just a totally different paradigm now.
It's the ultimate, scaled-up version of the only I can pick on my little brother dynamic. You might absolutely despise your own government. You might fight bitterly with them every single day. But the absolute second a heavily armed outsider kicks down your front door and starts setting fire to your living room, you close ranks.
You defend your home.
You grab whatever weapon is near, and you fight the intruder alongside the very people you hated yesterday.
It is fundamental human nature. The primal instinct for survival always supersedes political ideology. The West believed that applying maximum military pressure would break the bond between the state and the people.
But it did the opposite.
Right. Instead, the war hasn't softened Iranian resolve against the regime. It has hardened Iranian resolve against the invaders. The bombs forged a sudden, ironclad national unity that the regime could never have achieved on its own.
Which makes total logical sense when you are the one actively dodging the shrapnel and watching your city burn. The survival instinct kicks in. But this brings us to a glaring, bizarre, and frankly surreal contrast that Professor Nasser highlights.
Because there's a totally different reaction happening elsewhere.
Yes, because while the people inside Iran are closing ranks and bracing for impact to survive the bombardment, there is a specific, highly vocal segment of people outside of Iran who are reacting in a way that completely defies traditional logic and historical precedent.
We are talking about the deeply complex and disturbing reaction of certain factions within the Iranian diaspora.
Yes, this part of the analysis genuinely blew my mind. Nasser talks about segments of the Iranian diaspora, specifically communities living in the United States, Canada, and parts of Western Europe.
People who are safe from the bombs.
Right. As their ancestral homeland is being aggressively bombed, as ancient heritage sites are literally burning, these specific diaspora groups are out in the streets of Los Angeles or Toronto, waving Israeli flags. They are literally audibly chanting, "Thank you, Trump, thank you, Bibi Netanyahu," while the bombs fall in the cities where their cousins live.
This raises a profoundly important question about sociology and psychology because, historically speaking, this reaction is an incredible, almost unprecedented anomaly.
Doesn't happen with other groups.
No, Nasser specifically compares this to other massive traumatic domestic upheavals, like the Chinese Cultural Revolution or the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989. During those horrific, bloody events, Chinese dissidents fled the country in terror. They protested their authoritarian government from abroad. They lobbied the international community for sanctions.
But they didn't ask for bombs.
Exactly. Not a single Chinese dissident ever stood outside the White House and begged the United States military to drop high-explosive bombs on Beijing.
Right. You don't ask foreign powers to glass your own heritage. You don't beg an empire to vaporize the streets you grew up on just to kill the mayor. So why is it happening here? How does a diaspora reach a psychological breaking point where they are actively, joyfully cheering for the kinetic destruction of the country where their grandparents are buried?
Nasser breaks this down into two main sociological drivers, and it provides a fascinating, if incredibly bleak, look at modern psychological conditioning. The first driver is a profound, deep-seated identity crisis among exiles.
Okay, an identity crisis. How so?
There's a segment of the diaspora that left Iran and feels an intense, almost desperate desire to seamlessly assimilate into what they perceive as the white, mainstream, global North identity. However, to achieve this perceived assimilation, they feel they must explicitly, aggressively, and performatively reject their geographic, Arab, and Muslim regional context.
They want to be seen as distinct from the broader Middle East.
Yes. So it's a massive psychological overcorrection based on in-group, out-group dynamics. They look at the political landscape and think, mainstream America and Europe are heavily pro-Israel and anti-Hamas. Therefore, if I want to be accepted as a true Westerner, if I want to shed the stigma of being from the Middle East, I must adopt the most extreme, hawkish version of the prevailing Western stance.
They're trying to out-West the West.
Exactly. It is a fabricated imagination of identity that essentially says, true Iranian history stopped in the 7th century before the Arab conquests and the arrival of Islam. We are actually Indo-European. We are fundamentally Western in our souls. By loudly aligning with Maghier movements in the U.S. or hardline pro-Israel stances, they are performatively stripping away the geopolitical stigma they feel is attached to their origins. They are trying to irrevocably prove their Western loyalty by cheering for the destruction of their Eastern roots.
That is heartbreakingly twisted. It's a desire for acceptance manifesting as self-erasure. But the second driver Nasser points out is even more insidious because it explains exactly how that underlying identity crisis was maliciously exploited.
Right, the information warfare aspect.
He talks about a deliberate, decade-long campaign of psychological priming and the absolute weaponization of social media against these diaspora communities.
Yes, this is crucial. This diaspora hasn't just organically arrived at this extreme conclusion in a vacuum. They have been subject to a highly targeted, relentless media bombardment for well over 10 years.
Through what channels?
Nasser points to specific satellite television networks like Iran International alongside highly curated algorithmic social media feeds, which he notes have been heavily influenced, funded, and shaped by Israeli intelligence and psychological operations that have systematically radicalized these expatriates.
Professor Nasser compares this direct algorithmic radicalization to what happened in the United States during the 2016 election with the infamous Pizzagate phenomenon.
It is an incredibly apt and disturbing comparison. Think back to 2016. You had a specific demographic in America that was already primed with anger, economic anxiety, and a deep distrust of the political establishment.
They were vulnerable.
They were. They were then fed a constant algorithmic diet of highly specific, increasingly extreme media. This feedback loop tightened until they embraced a fabricated reality completely detached from basic facts or logic. They literally believe a major presidential candidate was running a satanic child trafficking ring out of the basement of a Washington, D.C. pizza parlor, a building that didn't even have a basement.
To the point where a guy showed up with a gun.
Exactly. An armed man showed up with an assault rifle to investigate and save the children.
Right, because when you are locked in an impenetrable, algorithmically sealed echo chamber, the absurd slowly becomes the obvious. The repetition creates the reality. So imagine you are a member of the Iranian diaspora for a second. You start with genuine, completely valid anger at the Islamic Republic's horrific human rights abuses.
Which is completely understandable.
But then you are trapped in a reality bubble so thick, so impermeable, that this legitimate anger is slowly morphed, algorithm by algorithm, broadcast by broadcast, into you openly cheering for the carpet bombing of a 7,000-year-old civilization.
It warps their reality.
It's like they've downloaded a completely different operating system for reality. The basic human empathy code has been corrupted and overwritten by the algorithm.
And that is the terrifying, invisible danger of modern, weaponized information warfare. It severs the fundamental connection to your own humanity, your own family, and your own history.
It turns you against your own people.
When you reach the point where you are waving a foreign flag and cheering for the destruction of the very hospitals and schools where your own cousins might be sheltering from the blast radius, you are no longer engaging in political opposition. You have become a tragic casualty of a psychological information war. You have been reprogrammed.
Which brings us full circle back to the overarching, deeply unsettling theme of this entire incredible analysis. Everything we've unpacked today, from the blindly optimistic, mismatched expectations in the Oval Office to the hidden, decentralized defensive strategies silently waiting in the mountain bunkers of Tehran, to the insidious algorithms radicalizing people in the suburbs of Toronto or Los Angeles, All of it exposes a fundamental, terrifying disconnect.
There's a massive gap between theory and reality.
Exactly. It is the vast chasm between what political leaders confidently expected to happen on paper and the bloody, unpredictable reality of what actually unfolded on the ground.
The assumption of linearity in warfare, the comforting but deeply flawed idea that action A will neatly, cleanly, and predictably result in expected result B, is almost always a fatal illusion. Human systems, especially ancient, complex nation-states, do not react like mathematical equations.
So let's take a breath and quickly synthesize the massive journey we've been on for you listening. We started by looking at a joint U.S.-Israeli decapitation strike that was explicitly meant to bring a quick, clean victory and collapse a regime.
But the regime was ready for it.
But instead, that strike revealed a deeply entrenched, highly decentralized Iranian defense mechanism deliberately designed to absorb punishment, exhaust Western interceptor missiles, and outlast Western political patience.
A total miscalculation.
We saw how the targeted assassination of the supreme leader, hailed as a massive victory, didn't bring about moderate surrender, but accidentally removed the very theological and strategic handbrakes that were keeping the conflict geographically contained and non-nuclear.
They unleashed the very thing they feared.
We watched how the threat of foreign bombs instantly forged a sudden, ironclad national unity inside Iran, completely marginalizing democratic reformists while simultaneously exposing a bizarre, algorithmically induced psychological fracture among the diaspora, cheering from the outside.
And this complexity is exactly why critical thinking isn't just an abstract academic exercise. It is an absolute requirement for understanding the modern world. You have to be able to look past the sanitized, focus groups' political rhetoric of surgical strikes, clean wars, and rapid regime change.
You have to look deeper.
You have to understand the messy, unpredictable, deeply human second and third order consequences. The geopolitical landscape is not a chessboard where pieces are removed cleanly and quietly. It is an incredibly tense, interconnected web, and when you violently sever one major thread, the entire global structure trembles in ways you cannot possibly control.
Which leaves us with a final, highly provocative thought. Something for you to deeply mull over long after this audio stops playing. Imagine looking at these intelligence readouts today. We know for a fact now that the old guard in Tehran, the clerics who feared existential escalation, who prioritized baseline regime survival over apocalyptic conflict, are largely gone.
The cautious voices are out.
We know the handbrake on Iran's ballistic missile ranges and their nuclear ambitions has been effectively destroyed along with them. If a new, younger generation of battle-hardened, heavily traumatized IRGC field commanders is now firmly in charge, commanders who survived the meat grinders of Syria, who have watched their cities burn, and who now feel they have absolutely nothing left to lose and everything to prove, what happens next?
It's a terrifying prospect.
What happens when a heavily armed military force, pushed to the absolute brink of annihilation, decides that its only remaining path to survival is to guarantee that its enemy suffers a completely unrecoverable blow?
It permanently changes the global calculus of deterrence. It means the old rules no longer apply.
It does. When the smoke finally clears and the dust settles in the Middle East, will the history books look back at the assassination of Ayatollah Khamenei not as a triumphant, decisive victory for Western precision, but as the exact fatal moment the diagnostic X-ray machine shattered, the illusion of control vanished, and the rules of global warfare were permanently, irreversibly rewritten in blood?
A murky, deeply perilous landscape indeed.
Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly deep, complex journey. Keep questioning the prevailing narrative, keep pushing to find the why and the how behind the what, and we will see you next time on The Deep Dive.